us today. If you haven't been here with us for a while, or this is your first time, just kind of get you up to speed. We've been in Matthew. Matthew, because the early church, if you didn't know, used Matthew as the template for discipleship. So in our 2020 vision, we want to get set off right, and we're trying to get those things in order so that we can all grow and be the disciples that God wants us to be. So today, we're in Matthew chapter 5, and I'm talking about the Master's Manifesto. What Jesus, our Master, has to say. And right off the bat, I want you to keep this in your mind as we go through this message here today. And that is that Christian discipleship, who we are, how we grow, our maturity in Christ, it requires a greater righteousness. More than we ever realize. And by the time we're done here today, I hope you'll look at righteousness a little bit differently than maybe you have before, because I think we get it wrong. And Jesus deals with that here in the Beatitudes that we're going to look at as part of this message. But up on the screen, you're going to see a picture of 3 cuddly animals. Leo, Baloo, and Kirk. They are at Noah's Ark Animal Shelter in Georgia. I don't know if any of you have ever heard this story about them before. If you Google them or you look at the videos, you'll see the lion and the tiger snuggling up and rubbing their head against the bear. And they just live in complete harmony. They don't fight with each other. And when you think about it, that really is not natural, is it? Lions, tigers, and bears, they're mine, right? They would fight with each other and kill everything else. But Leo, Baloo, and Kirk, not this case. Over 15 years, I think it is now, that they've lived together. Their natural instincts would make them enemies of each other. So how do they exist together? Maybe really think about that. See, without directions, think about those 3 animals. Think about people. Think about us in the church. Maybe you know somebody that is more like a lion or a tiger or a bear towards you, or you are like that towards them, that even lions, tigers, and bears in captivity live with each other. Unfortunately, sometimes we're like that. See, without those directions from Jesus, some of them that we're going to look at today, we're actually more like animals to each other than these 3 animals that live together in harmony. And that doesn't please God. Matthew breaks down Jesus' teachings in 5 different blocks of discourse in the whole book of Matthew. The first one is here, what we're going to look at today, Matthew 5 through 7, and you're probably familiar with it about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. Then the last 4 are chapter 10, chapter 13, 18, and 23 through 25. So if we look at that, there's an order in which Matthew has broken down some of the teachings, or the main teachings of Jesus, into discourses. Now, a discourse, what's a discourse? Does anybody know what a discourse is? What's that word mean? Anybody? It's a discussion. It's a speaking or a writing. Not just any discussion, but an authoritative discussion. So we know the Master, Jesus, is the one that's delivering it. So we can understand that it is authoritative teaching. These things are not optional. They are from the Master for us to listen to and to put into practice. So this is the first of his authoritative teachings about how we are to live as disciples in the kingdom. And we're going to find some answers to how we are to live, why it's important, and what exactly it accomplishes. So this is the Master's Manifesto. It's his public proclamation. It's his teaching about how he wants his followers to live. And I'm going to give you the key to understanding the entire Sermon on the Mount right now, here at the beginning. And it's going to guide our understanding, not only for today's message, but for all of chapters 5 through 7. And here it is. Unless our righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, we will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That is the key. Everything we read, everything we understand, and everything we apply relates to this concept of righteousness. Now let me ask you this. What is righteousness? Somebody tell me, what's your idea of righteousness? When you think righteousness, what do you What is it? Following Jesus. But what about that? What does that look like? How we live, isn't it? Here's where I think we get it mixed up. We think that our external righteousness, in other words, how hard we try to keep the rules, makes us right with God, and then He bestows His blessings on us because we're righteous in how we live. And you know, we've got it flipped upside down. Because I don't know if you've paid attention in your Christian walk, but the harder you try on your own power, the more taxing it is on your spiritual life. It's hard to keep up. And so righteousness is really important for us to get understood correctly, because if we don't, we're going to be missing the mark in a way that we don't even realize. So righteousness is really important. We're going to kind of unpack some of those things. But just think of it this way. Our righteousness flows from what God did for us. In other words, Romans 4 and 5, if you read those two chapters, Paul talks a lot about righteousness being declared to us based on our faith. In other words, we go to God, or God reaches down to us and saves us, and because we believe that, He pronounces us righteous. And then everything we do in our life flows from that. So it's about motivation. So despite the bad rap that Pharisees get, I don't know if you kind of fall into that trap when you read your Bible, but Pharisees they're on the wrong side all the time, aren't they? For the most part. They're the ones that antagonize Jesus and they do all these things in opposition to Him, but despite their bad rap, they were actually looked up to as examples. Because of their godly living, because of their external righteousness, they kept the law, they knew the Scriptures, and they lived right, at least outwardly. And unfortunately, their hearts were far from God. And they didn't even know it. That's why by the time you get to Matthew 15, Jesus, He calls them hypocrites. And He confronts them with the fact that they honor God with their lips. This is what He said. He quoted Isaiah, but their hearts were far from Him. Their worship, He said, was of no use because their teachings were not God, but get this, they were rules taught by people. We like to do that. We make up our own rules, and then we say, because we made our own rules, look how righteous we are. It's kind of a win-win situation in one way, but spiritually it is not a win-win at all, because it gets us farther from God and not closer. So if you have your Bible there, look at Matthew 5. We're going to read the first 12 verses and kind of unpack them. This is what you are familiar with the Beatitudes. So Matthew 5, here's what it says. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, He went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to Him, and He began to teach them. He said, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So, catch this scene. Jesus, if you remember from the end of chapter 4, He had just been healing all kinds of people. Crowds were following Him. And so what does He do? He goes up on a mountain to get away from the crowds and to teach His disciples. Now you have to think about who He was teaching here. His disciples were the people who had already repented. They had already committed to following Him. And it was more than just because of His willingness to heal. See, there's an element of people that were following Him just because of all the things that Jesus could do. But these were the disciples that had committed to following Him. See, they were committed. And so He sits down, which indicates His authority, because in their time, teachers sat down instead of standing. and talking like we do now. That's what we're used to, but it was a different culture. But notice some parallels here. There's a mountain. There's God's messenger. There's authoritative teaching, just like Moses, who went up on a mountain as God's messenger, and then he taught the people how they should live. And it's also not coincidental that Moses wrote 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And Matthew records 5 discourses of Jesus, where he explains how he is the fulfillment of the law. I think that's pretty cool. See, human beings, we get God's information all wrong on a regular basis, don't we? We think we're right, and we get it wrong. We twist his words, and we use them for our own selfish meanings. And Jesus sets things straight about how his disciples are actually to live here with this section on the Beatitudes. And Beatitudes actually just means supreme blessedness from the Latin. That's where we get the word Beatitudes. Don't you want to be blessed supremely? I think we do. We say God bless you after someone sneezes, don't we? We may end a conversation with, will you be blessed? Have a blessed day. Blessings to you. When you ask someone how their church service was, hopefully when you leave here from New Venture, you're going to say, oh, it was blessed. It was good. If you have an extra amount in your paycheck because you worked overtime, you might say that you had a blessing. It's admirable that we use these terms, but it appears that the word blessed actually has become a catchword and is overused. And I think that's important for us to understand when we read these Beatitudes. We shouldn't use the word out of habit or just because everybody else is doing so. See, when that happens, a word becomes void of its true and intended meaning, doesn't it? I use the same example with love. Do we really know what love is according to what the Bible says? We love everything. We love our spouse, we love our kids, we love pizza, we love, you fill in the blank. And I think we do the same thing in a way with blessing, especially in religious context. We as church people, we like to use words like that because what does it do? It makes us feel righteous because we're using the right words. I think we miss it. See, a blessing is not the result of accumulating material things. It's not even the result of how we feel. That's not what blessedness is. A blessing is God's divine favor that comes in the form of God's protection and his provisions for our happiness and our enjoyment. And it's related to our relationship with him. So when we read that we're blessed here in these Beatitudes, it's more along the lines of being fortunate, even privileged. You ever thought of that? You're privileged in God because of these Beatitudes, because of God's response to how we live in relationship with him. See, righteousness and relationships go hand in hand. That's what Jesus is talking about right here in this whole section. We're blessed. We're fortunate. We're privileged if we're poor in spirit. How many of you like to think of yourself as poor in spirit? Do you know what poor in spirit means? Poor in spirit is knowing that you have nothing to offer God. You're essentially spiritually bankrupt. You don't have anything to give. You can't manage on your own without God's presence in your life. You're spiritually powerless. That's what he's talking about here. Jesus says that if we are like that, then we're fortunate. We're blessed by God because we possess the kingdom. You notice when I read it, I accentuated the word is, present tense. He starts off these Beatitudes by saying, if you have that condition, that you're poor in spirit, you understand that everything you have is because of God, that you bring nothing to the table, then you can be sure that you're part of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, God is with us. And then he goes on and he uses mourning. If we mourn, we're going to be comforted. And this is the grief that comes not only from our own personal sin, where we feel bad about what we do. Maybe we know that we don't measure up, we don't live the way that we should all the time. But it's more than that. It could be a loss of a loved one. But it's the mourning over this sin-stained world. If you look around, I think we could agree. This world has been stained by sin and does not know God. We mourn for that. We're blessed when we find our comfort in God now, because we will be fully comforted in the future when He returns. And meekness. Meekness is not weakness. It's refusing to exercise your own power when you could for the betterment of someone else. This world pushes us to take all we can get for ourselves, doesn't it? That's not meekness. That's stepping on people. What better example than Jesus, who instead of saving Himself, He set aside His power and His authority and let Himself be killed so that we would have life. Shouldn't we imitate that selflessness, that humility as we deal with each other? I mean, the world mocks this, doesn't it? But God rewards it. If we hunger and we thirst for righteousness, we desire to see God's standard. Not that you want to push it on someone else, but that it flows up and wells up deep inside of us because of our relationship with Him. And we want to display and see that righteousness that God has for us. We desire to see it lived out everywhere. Yet we find ourselves disappointed, don't we? Because we can expect that desire to be satisfied, not necessarily now, but one day when justice reigns, when He returns. And merciful. Merciful is to be generous, to be forgiving and compassionate for those who are suffering, while also being a healing agent of God. We talked about that last week a little bit. We will get from God what we give to other people. If we are not healers, if we are not merciful to other people, then we can expect we will not receive it back. The pure in heart, He says the pure in heart are blessed and privileged because of moral uprightness that's greater than the outward ritual perfection. If you remember, you read about the Pharisees, they were great with the outward physical ritual cleanness. But their hearts, Jesus even said, were far from them. See, this devotion comes from the cleansing that only Jesus can provide through His sacrificial blood as we follow His instructions. And the reward is an intimate fellowship with God through Him. And then He says, peacemakers. Peacemakers. If you consider yourself a peacemaker, do you realize you're privileged to be the son or daughter of the King? Because God, in His effort to bring peace in our personal relationships. See, it's got to start with Him before we can have relationships right with each other. It's working for wholeness and harmony, rather than hostility and discord, as we reconcile other people to God and then to each other. And so these Beatitudes finish. He says the kingdom of God belongs to anyone who's persecuted because of living like this, the way Jesus gives us these instructions. Even though the world rejects these qualities, you are fortunate, you are privileged, you are blessed if you are treated badly because you live righteously. See, if you're mistreated, if you're shunned, if you're abused because you follow Jesus, then you can be sure that you are a disciple in the kingdom of heaven. So then here's the question, how are we to live? All of those things, are they easy? Is it easy to be merciful? Is it easy to be poor in spirit? Is it easy to be a peacemaker? Here's the thing. We are to live a changed life. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, if you are going to be in the kingdom, you will be defined by these 8 Beatitudes and how you live and associate with one another. Like Leo, Baloo, and Shere Khan, that lion, tiger, and bear. Can you see how that would be so important for His disciples living in the kingdom, that we don't eat each other up, that we have mercy and we have all of those qualities. So live a changed life according to those Beatitudes. Look at verse 13. We continue on here, because this just continues with, and we saw it on the Godspell video where they were singing about salt and light. But look what he says. You, after all of these Beatitudes, he transitions in, and basically the salt and light are the effects of living according to the Beatitudes. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So he moves on from Beatitudes, these qualities of how his followers are supposed to live, and he says, this is the purpose. The purpose of living that changed life is to be like salt and light, and to permeate society as God's agents of redemption. Doesn't it make us different when we live according to those Beatitudes? Do people notice? Yes. Do they take advantage of us? Yes, sometimes. But that shouldn't change the way we live. See, salt and light, they're positive, life-preserving, life-giving qualities. Salt's most basic use back in the ancient world was actually as a preservative of food. So if we're salt, then it makes sense to me that living righteously, those qualities in the Beatitudes, will act to slow or prevent moral decay. Now that doesn't mean on a wholesale, we're not going to change the world ourselves, but think of the influences you have, starting with your own family. If we live according to the Beatitudes, our children are going to live different. Our relatives are going to notice. If we live like that at work, our co-workers are going to notice. Our bosses might even notice. And it's going to permeate society. There's a saying that's attributed to Sir Edmund Burke, you may have heard before. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It's not take up arms in the worldly sense. The way we do something as good men and women is live as disciples in the kingdom according to the values of the Beatitudes that Jesus gave to us. So whether it was Burke or someone else, the statement is still true, and I think Jesus would agree with that statement. Because believers who fail to preserve life and stand against human corruption become worthless agents of change and redemption. Let that sink in. Think of that. That's what Jesus meant about not being good enough for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. It's how the world responds to believers that do this. Speak religiously and then live worldly. When we get the righteousness backwards and we think it's our own effort, guess what we do? We conform to the image that the world wants to label us as being self-righteous, hypocritical Christian people because we're trying to pass judgment on someone else because they don't fit our conformed set of rules. See how it flows from the inside out? That's what Jesus is talking about in the Beatitudes, and it leads right to this application, this purpose of living that changed life so that we can be salt and light. I remember years ago, I was younger, we took a trip with family to go visit relatives in Houston. And if you've ever driven down there, it's really flat, right? But I saw from like 35 miles away this light shining. And it seemed like we just couldn't get any closer, couldn't get any closer. You know what it was? It was the light from the city of Dallas. 35, 40 miles away. And that was on a flat place. There's a reason why Jesus said about let your light shine, like a city on a hill. Man, it permeates everything. When you're out in the middle of the blackest night and there is a light somewhere, you can't help but see it. And that's what we are being called to do, how we're supposed to live, because light brings vision, it brings illumination. And Jesus himself is the light of the world, is he not? His followers, you and I, are supposed to be light bearers. And the reason we shine that light of good works to the world is so that the world might have a reason to praise God. If it wasn't for his followers shining the light, how would the world even know what the choice is? See, the Beatitudes are values that show us as disciples of Jesus so that other people might find him through us. That's being salt. And that's being light. So the question is, why then? Why should we live that way? If that's the way we are living, why should we do it anyway? And I think the answer is this: that changed lives, they actually point other people to God, don't they? When people see the change in your life of how maybe you were not caring, you were not sympathetic or merciful, or you were not a peacemaker, and then all of a sudden they see that radical transformation in your life, they start to ask the question, what happened? Why are you so different? If you've ever had the blessing to be in that situation where someone came to you, you didn't jam it down their throat about what you believe, but they just could tell by your presence that something was different, I think that's permeating society. Let's look at the last 3 verses here. 17 to 20. Actually, I guess it's 4. But here's what it says. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law, until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands, I think he was talking about the Beatitudes, will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Or will be least in the kingdom, I'm sorry. But whoever practices and teaches these commands, those Beatitudes, will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. There it is again. Unless your righteousness surpasses. Hold on to that. Keep thinking about that. Jesus never contradicted the law, did he? They accused him of it, but he didn't. He came to fulfill it or to bring it to its intended goal. That's what it means. That's what Jesus did by coming and offering his teaching. The Pharisees and the scribes, they missed this completely. They were set on giving the expression of righteousness while their hearts were still far from God. See, we can follow a list of rules, but that's not what makes us righteous. Outwardly, they were religious. Inwardly, they lacked relationship with God. Here's something deep for you to chew on. Did you know that all of the Old Testament is relevant for Jesus' followers? Now that's kind of sticky though. Because you might say, whoa, okay, how do I live that out? Am I supposed to live exactly as they did? See, without Jesus, we will never correctly interpret the meaning of it. That's where we go wrong. That's where the Pharisees went wrong. Because they didn't connect Jesus to the very law that they were so proud of. See, I really believe that the reason we have so many divisions among Christian groups about what is or is not still applicable to us about the Old Testament is because we lack a correct understanding of who Jesus is. He wasn't just another teacher. He wasn't just another Moses. He was the fulfillment of everything. And so when he gave those Beatitudes, they weren't options. They weren't things for us to pick and choose as disciples. Okay, I'm good with being a peacemaker, but I don't really feel like being too merciful. See, it doesn't work out, does it? But isn't that what we do? We say, well, I'm okay, I'm good at those things, but there's other things that I'm not too good at. Jesus didn't give them as options for us. He said, if you are going to be blessed, fortunate, privileged in the kingdom, these are the ways that you're going to live, which were countercultural then, and they're countercultural now. See, the Jews, they ranked commandments into lesser and greater categories. We do the same thing, don't we? What sin's worse? This one or that one? Is a white lie as bad as a bold-faced lie? We do that. And Jesus, he is telling his disciples then and now not to ignore or teach others to set aside the things that are actually important to God. Because if they're important to God, they need to be important to us. But it starts with the right relationship with him. So guess what they point back to? The Beatitudes. The Pharisees, they thought they were in the kingdom based on their righteousness for their own sake. But they were not poor in spirit. They did not mourn for lost people. They certainly didn't show meekness from what I read. They didn't hunger and thirst for the right righteousness, but they hungered and thirsted for self-righteousness. They disguised their mercy with religion. They cared more about their ritual perfection than they did their purity of heart. They didn't work for peace in relationship with others. And they were the ones who did the persecuting of Jesus and his followers. And yet they were religious, but they were not in relationship with the true and living God. And then we get back to where we started today in verse 20. The key to understanding the entire Sermon on the Mount: unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And this is an enormous statement, because we turn that around into like a competition sometimes. Maybe you don't do it consciously, but if you look and you see how they upheld all the letter of the law. And I thought about this morning. Do you know that, for one example, on the Sabbath day, which is Saturday, not Sunday, on the Sabbath, Jews, even today, are prohibited from walking more than 6/10 of a mile in a straight line. But someone who is following the Old Covenant, the Hebrew Scriptures, that's the rule. Do you know why that's the rule? Because somewhere along the line, some people decided that they were going to make a rule to guard God's rule. Which, do we need to do that? Because I'm going to mess it up. His instruction is better than anything I could ever do. But to clarify, they said, if you walk more than 6/10 of a mile, that's considered work. And you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Now let me ask you this. Did you see how that would breed all kinds of ways out? So, wait a minute, 6/10 of a mile in a straight line. Well, what if I take a detour and it's not a complete straight line? Can I still do it? See, don't we do that with sin? Don't we do that with righteousness and the way that we're supposed to act? It's like, well, if I tell a little lie, maybe it's not as bad as a big lie. So really, it's not quite as bad. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because that's how dangerous it is. We can feel very religious. We can set up our own, what we think are safeguards. Why don't we just do what God says instead of making up our own ways? See, to the Jewish listener, and maybe to you also until today, Jesus' statement meant that no one ever had the hope of entering heaven. Because think about it. Remember, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were held up as this example of godly living. And for him to say, unless your righteousness surpasses them, you'll never enter the kingdom. That could be overwhelming. Unless you understand that it goes by your relationship. See, if your relationship is right, then you don't have to be self-righteous, because your righteousness comes from God. To the Jewish listener, they wouldn't have understood. Maybe even to us, to the average person trying to eke out a living back then or now, the Pharisees were the holy people. And Jesus claimed that even they weren't good enough. But here's the point. No amount of law-keeping, then or now, is good enough, because the problem is the human heart. See, viewing the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, apart from a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, leads to rule-keeping and empty religion. And we'll turn it into whatever suits our needs to make us feel good. And we miss it. So what does this accomplish then? God blesses the right relationship, not religion. See, there's all kinds of religion. We make up our own religion. If we don't have the right relationship with Him, then our righteousness will never surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. We'll miss it completely. See, it's not about what you do, but who you know. That's what they missed, and that's what we miss today. You might act religious and not know the God who made you. You may try to live according to some kind of moral principle and still be empty inside. Our relationship with God starts with our heart and works its way out into righteousness, not the other way around. You don't change your heart by trying to externally be righteous. When your heart is changed, you won't help. You won't be able to help but to live the way God tells you, the way Jesus said in the Beatitudes. You'll know that you're poor in heart or poor in spirit. You'll know all of those things. See, the Christian walk of a guy named Will Houghton, if you've ever heard his name, but he was a preacher who became the president of Moody Bible Institute back in the 1940s. And he played this role in the conversion of a guy who was an agnostic. He didn't believe. He didn't understand. He was contemplating suicide. And here's what he said. He said, because he was so desperate, he decided that if he could just find a minister who actually lived out his faith, like truly lived it out, then he would be willing to listen to it. He would hear what he had to say about God. So this guy, this skeptic, this agnostic, he hired a private detective. You talk about being serious about your spiritual outlook. He hired a private detective to follow Mr. Houghton around. And so after a period of time, the investigator sent back a report that revealed that Mr. Houghton actually was the kind of person who lived above reproach. He actually lived what he spoke of. He was for real. He had an authentic Christian walk. This man who was an agnostic then went to his church. He accepted Christ and later sent his daughter to Moody Bible Institute for her education. Now, I say that in closing because you don't know who's watching. And if we live according to the standards and the qualities of the Beatitudes, we will become salt and light to a dying world. And people will pay attention. They will notice. And we will be blessed because we will know that we are in the right relationship with our Creator God. So the Beatitudes tell us how to walk as disciples. And I see the steps of Jesus in every one of those verses. Here's the question. Do you walk like Jesus? Do you want to walk like Jesus? I hope you do. I'm going to ask you to stand as we sing. If you're already in a relationship with Christ and maybe you're struggling with how to live, we want to be that support to you as we try to live